Hello again, and welcome back to the Explaining History podcast. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Toby Manning, the author of Mixing Pop and Politics. I had to think of my favourite Billy Bragg lyric there for a moment. Mixing Pop and Politics, a Marxist history of popular music. So welcome, Toby. Am I correct in thinking that when we talk about Marxist histories of things, because this is a very kind of to those that aren't kind of embedded in kind of Marxist thought, what Marxist approaches to history are sort of quite misunderstood, and it's essentially the idea that kind of history is the product of kind of like material sort of relations and kind of that sort of thing. That history is made by the process of history is made kind of by who has the stuff and who does the work, to put it very, very crudely. How sort of does that translate into our understanding of this kind of really curious phenomenon of popular music since, say, the 1950s?
Okay, well, I guess, yes, I suppose it's an attempt to move away from popular culture, specifically music, as being in some sort of separate category of the aesthetic and to try and move it into the material without that becoming, I don't know, without sort of removing the appeal or the magic of music or the power of music. In fact, I mean, I suppose I think that in some ways it enhances the power and the sort of depth of music and the importance of music.
Yeah, yeah. And a lot of what the sorry, my little boy is just making an awful lot of noise in the background. Hold on a moment. Um, there you go. Adding a bit of kind of edgy realism to the podcast, Um, a lot of what sort of seems to transpire in the title is the idea of that pop music is also the product of kind of conflict as well, and sort of protest and that kind of thing. Um, I mean, to what extent really is that the case? I mean, if we look at the history of pop music, are moments of kind of social and cultural struggle within pop music sort of outliers, and are we all just listening to kind of melodies that make us feel better, or is it really sort of central to to the history of popular music?
I mean, obviously there are different phases of this. You know, it's not just one sort of long, sort of samey sweep. But I mean, I would say particularly in the first sort of 30 or so years of popular music that I chart from. So just to clarify, so I start kind of with rock and roll, in about from around 1953, 1954.
Yeah,
I think that conflict is absolutely central. That some level of you know protest music has a very specific kind of notion that it has to be kind of quite explicitly political, that it's about a particular issue or something. But it seems to me that an awful lot of music has been essentially a protest about things like societal expectation, the way that we live, the way that we're forced to live or behave, and so on and so forth. So it feels to me like the protest and the conflict is often quite subtle, and a lot of the time we miss it. I mean, I missed it for because of this sort of aestheticization of culture. I just treated music as a sort of separate thing to politics, and I never thought it had much relationship to the sort of socio-political currents which produced it.
yeah. I mean, and I think the thing is that um, music, music is obviously always made by people, and people will always be situated within society in a particular set of relations, not always of their choosing, not always to of their kind of not as of benefit to them. So you're always getting you know there are always elements of struggle in whatever people do culturally. Of course, the beginnings of popular culture. I mean, you started in the 1950s, but obviously you know that you have to really look all the way back to the turn of the century almost to see the kind of the development of the recording artist and that kind of thing. But the reason why I think the 1950s are important is because you have this explosion of mass affluence. after the Second World War. I mean, obviously in Britain there's only a period of austerity, but by the time you're getting to the era of kind of Little Richard and then Elvis and then eventually the Beatles, we're going through this period of time, which is almost completely unprecedented in the 50s and 60s. And you mentioned expectations, and I often think about the kind of the kitchen sink dramas of that period, things like kind of Saturday Night and Sunday Morning, and which is all about working class life, and actually working class life that's getting better, but people being dissatisfied with all the realities of work. And with that period of mass affluence, is that the kind of one of the sort of the sort of the instrumental factors that makes popular culture as we understand it?
Yeah, I mean it's quite complicated, obviously, as you suggest, because I think the 50s, as I say in my book, has become this sort of halcyon age, actually for left and right in a strange kind of way. But for conservatives, it's just this period of sort of stability and conformity, which has to overlook an awful lot of what I'm writing about in my book, not to mention, add in civil rights, add in the angry young men, etc. So, yeah. So I think that So basically, yeah, I mean, I quote Jeremy Gilbert saying that the 50s, as it were, was the first time when people didn't have to worry about where their next meal was coming from.
Yeah.
And so both that both sort of, I think, and that and the welfare state underwrites some new possibilities that the working class hadn't had before. It gave them new options apart from just working at a dead end job. It made it seem possible for them to enter the cultural milieu. There was the establishment of art schools, and more working class people were going to university, and so horizons and expectations were expanding. But I also think that the kids sort of brought up into this sort of new world who hadn't had that experience of privation, therefore grew up with sort of new expectations sort of instilled in them. They didn't feel the same need to be sort of almost grateful for what they were for these things that they were given. My argument is very much that you have to be careful with this. I feel like social democracy, if we're going to call it that, is the sort of condition of possibility for these various youth and cultural movements, and which on some level you can say, well, gosh, that's rather ungrateful, isn't it? They get given all this stuff and they turn around and say, no, we want more, like Oliver. But on the other hand, that leaves out the fact that these things that had happened, they didn't just happen because of the largesse of the ruling class or organically. They were the result of a very long, bloody struggle on the part of the working class, in the face and resistance of the ruling class. So, it seems to me that therefore demanding yet more is just a perfectly logical consequence of that sort of longer sweep, Yeah.
I mean, if you take the song "Working Class Hero" by John Lennon, in that he sort of details, what it's like to grow up working class. I mean, there are all these sort of debates about whether he was actually a sort of a member of the petty bourgeoisie, or and that's perhaps by the by. His Aunt Mimi, I think, was kind of not quite so proletarian, but he describes that sort of kind of simmering anger and resentment throughout the song, and I guess that's kind of a sort of snapshot of what you're talking about, in a way that yes, he had been the beneficiary of progressive change since the end of the Second World War, but was still kind of I was angry for a variety of reasons, but angry about the experience of kind of class and the experience of growing up, in a very kind of class-bound society.
Well, his words are very carefully chosen. You think you're so clever and classless and free, but you're still fucking peasants, as far as I can see. You
Yeah,
know, so that gets to it, doesn't it? That classless was the buzzword of the 60s very
yeah.
much, you know, that we transcended class. Whereas he's basically saying that the class system still exists, and he'd been at the coalface of it because I mean, just look at something quite structural like the way that EMI treated the Beatles initially, and even late on, if you watch that Get Back documentary, EMI is still just furiously penny pinching regarding this sort of, you know, jumped up upstart proletarian art form that is pop music. So, you know, they're kind of having to beg for, you know, for all sorts of equipment, for cameras, for keyboards, for, you know, etc. You know, and like there's no budget. And this is the biggest group in the world.
I was reading a while back, and it's a great book if you haven't read it. Duff McKagan's autobiography. It's so easy, I know the lies. And he talks about Guns N' Roses being on the road. And he took, you know, you have then basically a bunch of working class guys, you know, by and large. And the extent to which suddenly, and well, perhaps this had been happening long before, record companies were looking to mine this. Essentially, you know, they were record company guys that weren't interested in music, didn't care about music, but they thought, here you have a bunch of guys, and they're going to be around for 5 years max. And in that time, we need to extract literally every single last dime we can from it. And it's like said like a true capitalist, you know, said like a true kind of person who understands their role as a capitalist is to extract, you know, you'll make these guys very rich and they'll probably die of drug overdoses, and that sort of doesn't really matter. There'll be wonderful t-shirts to print about them and their obituaries to write. But you extract, and then dump. Was that the model right from the get-go?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, going back to the Beatles, that would be the next. Apart from the fact you have the, you know, the sort of patrician EMI kind of corporate types, you have you know, there was sort of a lot of controls initially about what you could do in the studio. There was the attempt to enforce like other people's songs on them and stuff. But yeah, the worst thing I think, which is still going on in about 1960, well, actually, it ultimately results in them refusing point blank to tour anymore, was just that they were worked to death. Because yes,
Yeah,
as you say, it was going to be a short-lived phenomenon. They want to extract every penny they could out of it. The deals were horrendous. That was one massive ingredient in Brian Epstein's suicide, I think, is that they were just, you know, exploited and ripped off in every single direction. And yeah, they were just flogged to death on these tours of American towns, like endless dates, you know, endless promo, etc. So that, yeah, I mean, but going back as well, I think that the Baz Luhrmann Elvis movie, so you know, for all its sort of fast and looseness in some ways, gets to a real truth, you know. So it sort of personalizes it, so it makes, you know, to me, the character of Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis Presley's manager in that, is the sort of personification of capitalism, and Elvis becomes the personification of the sort of proletarian pop performer, you know,
yeah.
and you just see the sort of, you know, the puppet master controlling the strings, you know, pushing their product into the things that will extract the maximum capital. Yeah.
I was reading a thing the other day by Bourdieu about taste and about how the reason why, for example, it's been, you know, we look at men in expensive, you know, £3,000 suits, isn't it? Because they're wearing this sort of absurd outfit, but that's the language of class, and this is what is communicated as desirable, and the person you know, modelled in the suit is powerful. But what kind of happens at a certain point in the 1960s, maybe, is I think that all of a sudden mass culture is suddenly identified by capital as being, no, that's where it's at. And so kind of the cool is mined.
Mm.
And there was a lot of talk about mining cool when grunge came around, and you know, it sort of very quickly its authenticity is shredded, and there are all sorts of kind of you know, the look is appropriated. But capital's very good at that. You know, it's very skilled in spotting punk or grunge or metal or whatever it is and mining it. Is that a theme that you've seen in the work that you've done?
Absolutely, and that relates back to that would be one definition I would say of the ongoing struggle in pop music constantly. The struggle is that it's daft in a way to expect capitalism to do anything else. That's what it's great at, as you say. It's part of the dynamism of capitalism, which we underestimate at our peril. It
Yeah,
will, if it can't contain and therefore kind of repress and overlay with something else, which it tried to do to rock and roll, and tried to restore post-war balladry,
yeah,
but then it all broke out again with the British invasion. So if it can't contain, then it co-opts or
yeah,
incorporates whatever language. And so to me, what is actually rather than just go, oh God, in a kind of a sort of Adorno-ish way, that just means that everything is sort of is just a sort of tool and product of capitalism.
yeah,
Whenever it's, I mean, Adorno even allows for the fact it might start off at something else. To me, that is actually the dynamism of popular culture as well, is that it has to reconfigure, it
yeah.
has to reinvent, and that's why you get new genres inventing themselves. You get, completely just something else bubbles up from the street up that
Yeah.
replaces the kind of bloated, corporatized genre that was once exciting.
Yeah. And I always found the kind of the Adorno culture industry sort of fatalism kind of a bit, almost a bit of a cop out kind of, it's also tainted. You can't, the only music that's virtually unlistenable to can possibly be viewed as having any authenticity at all. You think, well, it's no bloody use, is it? But also,
Very elitist. It
yeah,
only allows the upper class creator and the upper class audience agency. Nobody else has any agency.
yeah, yeah, and and also it totally. If you look at everything from country to hip hop, or working class music, right from the get go. I
I
always,
just underline that. Sorry to interrupt, but I just think it's an incredibly important point that I'm not sure if even I was fully aware of before I started researching this book. And people just don't get it.
yeah,
Music, popular music, on the whole, is the music of the working class, not the
yeah.
white working class, the working class as a whole. The multicultural working class.
One of the things I found odd recently, I listened to Beyonce's country album, and
Yeah.
it didn't actually sound like a country album to me as at all. It sounded like there's nothing inherently wrong with it. It sounded like a Beyonce album, but also there was, I mean, country music is about misery, and it's about truck drives in the rain and hardship and tough lives and coal miners' daughters and all that kind of stuff. And it's like, well, if you're going to do a country album, you got to do something about being poor and having a tough time, surely. And again, it seemed like a kind of a genre, a sound that had been mined and sort of this kind of very produced, very slick sort of album had come as a result, but it doesn't really have any of the essence of country music in it. So you may have listened to it, I don't know, but
I have actually, as it happens. Yeah, I mean, just to, out of pedantry, I want to say I think there's quite a lot of joy in country music as well.
oh yeah,
Sometimes there's sort of joy within the misery, which is, I suppose, one could say problematic, depending on where they locate the misery. And one of the things I feel is that over the 70s, as sort of in line with Nixon's Southern strategy, I kind of feel like the cause of the sort of poverty began to be celebrated as a sort of aspect of proletarian pride, as it were.
yeah, we've had it
Seen as
tough, that
kind of
kind of,
angry about or like that might be changing.
yeah,
But in terms of Cowboy Carter, yeah, the Beyonce album, yeah, I suppose you're right. There's not a great deal of pain or misery or even particularly conflict in it. The reason that perhaps I think it's reasonably progressive is almost just its ontology, just the fact that it exists and that Beyonce did it, and so that she did it because she felt unwelcome at the Country Music Awards when she played with the Chicks, formerly the Dixie Chicks, and she felt like and she hasn't said it quite explicitly, but I think it's implied in who she's chosen to work with on the
yeah,
album. It's just that there is, country music isn't strictly the music of the white working class. Once again, it's always, it's thoroughly intermingled and fused and derived from blues, to a certain extent from jazz. There have always been black country performers, not just Charlie Pride. So I think just particularly at this moment, after there were those two hideous, equally not particularly country, but acclaimed as country songs that went to #1 in America last year. Try That in a Small Town and Rich Men North of Richmond. Sort of Trumpian
Oh
MAGA
yeah,
hit. And I feel like this was therefore kind of an important political moment to produce a black, country album, I
yeah,
suppose. Yeah.
yeah. I guess one thing that I noticed recently that John Savage has got a book. I don't know if it's out yet, but it was coming out about kind of essentially a queer history of pop. And I
Mm.
think there's this sort of kind of an overlap between those two histories. That if you look at um, everyone from Little Richard to George Michael to various other key queer um, figures, that they become sites of sort of resistance, experimentation, of identity, and I think they're figures that are for the music industry, it's a music capital, often finds it very difficult to know what to do with them, other than obviously suppress their queer identity completely. I mean,
Mm.
has that come up as a theme in your writing? There's that overlap there.
Very much so, right from the opening pages, I talk about that because essentially, yeah, popular music is working class, black, which I would include as working class, but it probably needs separately stating, and queer, and one or the other, and quite often all three.
Yeah,
So yeah, it's just, and that's where, as you say, there's Little Richard, but there's intense channeling of queer culture, even just within rock and roll, even within, Jailhouse Rock by Elvis Presley, for instance. It's always there. There's
yeah,
these strange currents in some girl group stuff. It's there in the 60s, in mod. Obviously, it's front and central in glam. It's still there, very present in a lot of punk and post-punk. It's there throughout 80s pop and so on and so forth. Yeah, so it's absolutely vital. I mean, sorry, left out the absolutely crucial one, disco, which is
yeah.
both black and queer. So yeah.
And I think there was a brilliant book on the 1930s by Juliet Gardner. I think it's called An Intimate History. And there's a bit at the end of it where she's just talking about working class life, and she talks about the experience of gay male life in working class London. And she said the picture that she paints is where lots of things are kind of known and tolerated, and there's a sort of a general understanding in these sort of very close knit sort of terraced kind of houses, where houses are kind of very close together. That sort of if men were having kind of secret relations with one another, that it was all kind of known about but not spoken about, and there were sort of all sorts of social ways of kind of managing these sorts of things. Um, and I guess when you get to sort of this explosion of popular culture, and there are these kind of queer life runs through it, as you said. I think that there are moments where you go from this sort of kind of version of kind of repression, really, into kind of the desire to be kind of explicit about self and identity. And this is where you get some really in the first version of Tutti Frutti, I think it is, by Little Richard. It's really much more explicit about essentially being a rent boy. I think was the gist of it. And then there's the famous sort of Starman moment where kind of with David Bowie. What do you think enables that? I mean, other than sort of pure sort of artistic integrity and courage, but is there a kind of structural explanation to that ability to be explicit about oneself in ways that were taboo, kind of transgressing?
Yeah, well, as you say, that wasn't really possible in Little Richard's time. Thus the kind of bowdlerization of Tutti Frutti. But I guess Little Richard made the subliminal about as explicit as you possibly could, right? So just in his performance style.
Yeah,
Um, and I would say structurally, I mean, this is a slightly liberal argument, though it's also a historical argument. I would just say the fact that there's the 1967 Sexual Offences Act, which makes homosexuality at least semi-legal, which both reflects, but probably more important, leads public attitudes towards homosexuality. So they soften somewhat.
yeah,
There's a sort of symbolic, formal public softening towards the idea of queerness.
yeah,
So it's strikes me that it can't be a coincidence that therefore a couple of years later, in the early 70s, the sort of the iconography and the vocabulary and sometimes explicit reference to homosexuality are therefore, are rendered possible.
and you have, I mean, I think it was Freddie Mercury who famously said, "Well, I'm not coming out because of a commercial suicide," which is, I mean, I totally respect that, and it's obviously everybody's individual choice to be in or out or whatever. But it does show you what his thinking was, and he was he wanted to sell records, and he said, he, even though there had been those sort of legal changes, that his audience, he understood it was broadly, as far as he was concerned, heterosexual young men who would buy Queen albums and didn't want to, and he didn't want to kind of rock the boat in that way. So there's still all those kinds of constraints there, I suppose. That
Oh,
we
yeah, plenty. I mean, I actually think a lot of reaction to David Bowie's announcement that he was bisexual in '72 was not positive in terms of like the letters that were arriving at the sort of music press. But in terms of the case of Freddie Mercury, it's particularly interesting because he kind of did a Little Richard in a way, in that he made it about as strongly implicit as you could possibly do, from the name of the band to the way he performed to
yeah,
his look by the sort of late '70s, early '80s with the sort of clone look with the tash and everything. And I hate to say it, but he was probably proved right, because when they did the "I Want to Break Free" drag video,
yeah,
uh, there it tanked in America. They had an absolutely huge hit before that with Radio Gaga, which is sort of slightly fascistic, sort of seeming sort of populist anthem. Then
yeah,
they do, something which isn't actually a million miles away stylistically. I want to break free, because the drag video, it just tanks completely. It destroys their career in America, and they never really recovered in America, even after the triumph of Live Aid.
yeah,
They never recovered in America, and so he kind of had a point.
yeah,
I
yeah.
suppose, I mean, it's still depressing that, that so much of the history of queer music is essentially, which is misunderstood. We think these things are obvious now because of how implicit it was at the time. We read it back rather wisely. But in
Hmm.
fact, it wasn't necessarily understood except a very subliminal level back in the day.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And I think also the advances in gay liberation that have been made since the 1980s, and where we are now, which is, there are some kind of there is some kind of rollback at the moment, but broadly things are much, much better than they were sort of 40 years ago. Um, I think it's quite difficult looking back to recognize what what a what a battlefield, particularly in the 1980s, gay rights and gay liberation were. And what and I always find one of the 80s very interesting period, a period of acute sort of tabloid homophobia. But if you look at the kind of British pop music from Wham to the Pet Shop Boys to Bronski Beat to, I can think of several others, but Frankie Goes to Hollywood, obviously. A number of kind of either explicitly queer or clearly, whilst they're not out clearly, evidently indicating it, pop groups in that period. There's something really interesting about that about that moment, I guess my theory is that you have, you know, the beginnings of liberalization in the 60s, but you don't really see, there's a kind of a lag time, and the 80s are kind of the sort of a period where the beginnings of things in the 60s are actually kind of begin to materialize.
Yeah, that's actually really cute, actually. I think that, yeah, I suppose what the 80s neoliberal regimes of Thatcher and Reagan hadn't cottoned on to, which the sort of so-called left neoliberal later regimes later of Clinton and Blair would, is that you could the co-optation of this of various 60s ideas, which was already underway in the 80s, hadn't got as far as sort of as social liberalism. It's got as far as sort of some notion of freedom. Let's repurpose the sort of countercultural notion of freedom as sort of competitive individualism in the marketplace. But Reagan and Thatcher remained social conservatives. And so, yeah, I mean, what I say in the book is that the 80s was equally one of the most, homoerotic eras in pop, but it's also an incredibly homophobic. 80s, homophobia and homoeroticism are sort of equally 80s tropes, as it were. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, and I try to say it neutrally because I don't mean to point any fingers at anyone, but it's just all of the things that we think were obviously gay about the 80s weren't quite so clear at the time, and I lived through it. We didn't know because he was evasive about it that Neil Tennant of the Pet Shop Boys was gay.
Yeah.
George Michael was certainly not out,
Yeah.
and Elton John married a woman. We didn't know that Elton John was gay. Morrissey was rather vague. Boy George was rather vague and denied being gay. Even that seems incomprehensible now. But so there was really only, I think, Mark Ullman was fairly explicit, and I think that and Brodsky Beat were, as you say. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. We must draw to a close in a moment, but I was thinking there's so much to talk about here, and we haven't even really looked at particularly black music, which it would be really interesting to talk about again in the future if you'd like to.
Absolutely.
Well, fantastic. Well, what I'd like to do, Toby, is perhaps in a little while invite you back on the podcast to talk further about some of these issues because. I mean, I do a little bit about popular music in this podcast, but not a lot. So it'd be great to continue the chat if you'd be up for that.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, let's get onto the plug. So available in all good bookshops at the moment, is that right?
Bookshops on Amazon, direct from Repeater, from Houseman's, wherever you like. Yeah, Mixing Pop and Politics, A Marxist History of Popular Music, published by Repeater, out now.
Brilliant. And as we always say at the end of the podcast, if you can, please get the book from an independent retailer. The big guys have got more than enough money, so make sure the little guys get as much help from you as you can. I'll put a link to the book in the podcast show notes. But for now, Toby, it's been a real pleasure to talk to you. It's been fascinating, and I'm really looking forward to talking further. So let's catch up next time. And all the very best.
Thank you very much. Really enjoyed it. Take care.
You bet.